All right. Hello and welcome to CRS's Clean Energy Accounting Project webinar. Welcome and thank you for joining. We're here today to talk about the Clean Energy Accounting Project's inaugural report, which is Accounting for Standard Delivery Renewable Energy. I'm Peggy Kellen, a Policy Director at Center for Resource Solutions, or CRS. And we're going to get started about on time because we have a lot to cover here today. So our webinar is looking at a project CRS undertook over the last year to define consensus on whether and how to account for standard delivery renewable energy when tracking renewable energy and greenhouse gas targets. We'll begin with an overview of the project and process used to develop the report, followed by the report's main findings, some context on how it interacts with the definition of leadership, and a closer look from a renewable energy buyer's perspective, in this case, Target Corporation, a generous sponsor of this work. We will wrap up taking questions from you. Our speakers today include my colleagues at CRS, Todd Jones, James Critchfield from US EPA, and Holly Laud from the Target Corporation. Before we start, I do have a few housekeeping items. This webinar and the slides will be recorded and posted on the CRS website in the next few days. Also, we will be holding Q&A until the end, but please do ask any questions in the side box as we go. We'll be reading and addressing as many as possible with our speakers, but if we are unable to respond to everything during the call, I will make sure to get back to you directly. To begin with some background on who we are, Center for Resource Solutions is a nonprofit founded in 1997, working to advance sustainable energy through policy and market solutions. We do engagement in sustainable energy policy and market expansion, and we have an education program that includes annual conferences, webinars like this one, and a library of published reports. But we are probably best known for Green E, a consumer protection certification program for businesses and individuals that use markets to voluntarily go above and beyond government requirements to address their environmental footprints. So CRS launched CAP in 2020 under our Renewable Energy Policy and Market Development Program to design and publish standardized, stakeholder-reviewed clean energy and greenhouse gas emissions accounting guidance addressing outstanding questions in voluntary and regulatory markets. As more companies and communities set goals in this space, they are often constrained by the lack of information on measuring energy and associated greenhouse gases. CAP seeks to advance the transition to a clean energy economy by working collaboratively to resolve areas of confusion and ensure consistent and credible accounting. So onto the project. To begin, I'd like to make sure we're all starting with the same understanding of the difference between voluntary and standard delivery renewable energy. So the voluntary market represents actively procured renewable energy above and beyond generation that would have been delivered as a result of a government mandate. This quality is often called regulatory surplus. Although it is still rare, the voluntary market also excludes renewables that default retail providers deliver on behalf of all customers beyond government mandates. So even though delivery of this generation is not required, the consumer has not made an active choice to procure it. Active purchases in the voluntary market are driven by consumer preference for certain attributes. By claiming these attributes, customers are able to reduce the environmental impact of their electricity use in a manner that aligns with their own values. Consumption of attributes through the retirement of renewable energy certificates, or RECs, also reduces REC supply. So any resulting increase in prices will send an indirect signal to the market to develop new renewable generation. Consumers who want to have a more direct impact on the development of new renewables can also use certain purchasing options that go beyond a commitment to purchase RECs. So standard delivery renewable energy, which we're talking about today, is the flip side of the coin. There is no active procurement by the customer, and generation is typically delivered on behalf of all customers. As consumers strive to reach 100% renewable energy or net zero targets, standard delivery renewable energy can be seen as a tool to reduce over-procurement or purchasing more attributes than the megawatt hours of energy you actually consume. It also suffers from data challenges that are not as common when a buyer has a direct role in securing those attributes. Perhaps most importantly, because you're consuming something that would have been provided to you anyways, consuming the power itself is not directly impactful. So we began this project seeking to address two related problems. First, consumers actively managing their electricity procurement to meet energy and greenhouse gas targets were finding that there were different accounting approaches to accounting for renewable energy that they did not actively procure. It was not always acceptable or clear if it was acceptable to include these resources on goal tracking. Beyond this question was the lack of clarity about the data that would be needed to support standard delivery renewable energy use claims. So our objectives were to clarify the market perspective on when the use of standard delivery renewable energy could be credibly reported by consumers and to identify the resources needed to do so. We began by developing a survey to allow a wide group of stakeholders and renewable energy buyers to provide perspective on how to meet our objectives. Findings from this survey helped to shape each of the two virtual workshops. The first meeting focused on identifying consensus around credible claims of standard delivery renewable energy use. And to support this conversation, CRS also developed a background report that summarized and compared current program requirements for accounting for delivered renewable energy. The second workshop was a deep dive into data available to document the delivery of this energy in the US. A second resource was developed to help stakeholders evaluate available data sources. It examines the underlying calculation methods for each representative source and highlights variability within and across them. Both supporting documents have now been published by CRS and are available to download from the website. The findings report was then drafted to reflect the outcomes of the two workshops and was circulated to participating stakeholders for their review and feedback prior to finalization. So CRS would like to thank all of the workshop participants and reviewers who contributed to these discussions. This group included leading renewable energy and greenhouse gas accounting NGOs, government representatives, electric utilities, large corporate energy buyers, renewable energy market brokers, and consultants. It was a very diverse and helpful group. I'm also delighted to share that the findings outlined in the report are expressly supported by CDP, the Climate Registry, and RE100. Their engagement and endorsement helps to achieve CEAP's goal of building consensus in the market. All right, so about the report. The report is intended to advance electricity market best practices when taken together with other standards, such as those provided by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And just to note, this effort did focus on renewables in the US market, but key principles may be applied to clean energy accounting and in other markets that support the trading of renewable and clean energy attributes. The report includes the four main sections outlined here, and I'll be highlighting the first section before handing over the reins to our next presenter. And that is the consensus statement itself. Participating stakeholders came to a strong consensus that consumers can claim to be using standard delivery renewable energy when renewable energy attributes and other requirements for credible electricity usage claims are substantiated using high quality data. The exact statement on this slide specifically requires that the attributes of renewable energy must be retained or retired by the claiming party. In practice, that may be an individual customer or a group of customers, for example, customers participating in a standard offer utility product. Participants were clear that this is a consensus on credible accounting, but as definitions of leadership may differ for different programs, those programs may require that the participants go above and beyond credible accounting to participate in any given initiative. Once our stakeholders were happy with this statement, it was time to move on to the question of data. And for that, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Todd Jones. One second while I give control back to him.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself before I share my screen. All right, can everyone see the slides? All right. Thanks, Peggy. So I'll be going over the portions of the report related to standard delivery renewable energy data. And I'll sort of spoil my presentation for you right up front here. The data or the information needed to substantiate a credible claim to standard delivery renewable energy is inconsistent and often unavailable. There's a clear difference between the information that is typically available and provided to customers when they voluntarily or actively procure renewable energy, regardless of how, and the information that's available about publicly shared renewable energy in a standard product offer, and even renewable energy that's delivered to all utility customers by regulation in terms of the availability, the consistency, and the credibility of that information. So when companies are actively procuring renewable energy, the provider and third-party certifiers typically provide reliable information with the purchase, like an amount, resource types and locations of the projects, the vintage of the generation, and importantly, REC retirement information, which helps ensure the credibility of the buyer's renewable electricity consumption claims. And that's simply not the case for standard delivery renewable energy. There are a variety of different data sources and variability across and within them. And this may prevent consumers from making credible claims to standard delivery renewable energy in practice, either using a particular data source or entirely depending on the data sources that are available. And on top of that, consumers with additional preferences or requirements for their own renewable energy in terms of specific resource types, the age and location, or size of the facilities, the type of procurement, if it's bundled or unbundled, they may find it even more challenging to find the data that they need to make credible consumption claims to standard delivery renewable energy. So in our report, we looked at aspects of the data affecting accurate accounting and credible claims, and we found significant limitations and challenges. But consumers may need to look even closer depending on their preferences, and they may encounter even greater limitations and challenges. So let's look at the data sources. We organized potential and commonly used standard delivery renewable energy data sources into these 4 categories or types of data for the US. Supplier specific information that's not RPS data, and then RPS compliance data, regional residual mixes, and grid average emissions factors. These categories generally align with the categories in the market-based Scope 2 data hierarchy in the GHG Protocol Scope 2 guidance, though the guidance does not break out RPS data separately. And these can be data for resource mix based on fuel type, or GHG emissions, carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, or both. I'll briefly describe each category, where the data typically comes from and what the typical scope for each is, and how each sort of reflects standard delivery renewable energy. So supplier-specific data is information about GHG emissions or the resource mix representing the portfolio of resources used, so owned or procured for retail customers or sales. So this is information about delivered electricity, supplier-specific mixes and emissions for standard offer or default products that do not include generation used for voluntary green power products, may include renewable energy that may be considered standard delivery renewable energy for customers using that product. Supplier-specific data may be product-specific or by state, or for the whole utility. And this data can come from programs or databases that aggregate data that is voluntarily provided to them by suppliers, or it can come from individual utilities. Or it can come from state power source disclosure programs, which would be state required supplier-specific data. So supplier-specific data about standard delivery renewable energy can also come from state RPS compliance, information, but we broke that data out separately as its own category. There's also supplier-specific data about generated electricity, including from certain state power source disclosure programs and different databases, or from individual utilities, which would not represent delivered electricity. And then RPS compliance data is documentation of load serving entity or statewide compliance with regulatory mandates that by and large require load serving entities to supply a percentage of retail sales with renewable resources. In that case, the compliance data would represent utility specific information, again, about delivered electricity. So depending on how the programs are structured, utility RPS compliance might represent a percentage of renewable energy that's delivered to and that may be claimed by all utility customers. In general terms, regional residual mix data represents untracked or unclaimed energy and emissions, which can also be thought of sort of standard or publicly shared electricity generation. So we can think of that as including standard delivery renewable energy. In practice, actual residual mixes might be calculated in very different ways. For example, as energy production data or generation data that just factors out voluntary purchases, in which case the residual mix would include the RPS generation, for example, or it could be calculated as generation attributes that are remaining after all specified power and REC purchases are removed from the system as sort of unsettled generation, in which case the residual mix would not include RPS generation. We've defined standard delivery renewable energy to include RPS generation, but whether the residual mix includes RPS generation or the total amount of standard delivery renewable energy that may be claimed depends on how the residual mix is calculated. And it can come from regional or state tracking systems or other programs that collect data for different regions or geographic areas. And then finally, there's the total grid mixes or the grid average emissions factors, which are typically just production data, right? Data that represents the generation that occurs within a specific geographic region. And this data can take into account, power that's imported into the area and exported out of that area or not. If it does, then it might represent the grid mix for an estimated area of consumption rather than an area of production. But regardless, it does not represent delivered electricity because it doesn't consider transactions of specified power within the region or of attributes in and out of the region. So in other words, whether generation has been assigned to retail load in that area or specific load within that area. So, so this data should be distinguished, I think, from utility specific and residual mixes that do represent delivered electricity. The renewable energy in a grid average may include renewable energy that is delivered by default to customers, as well as other renewable energy located in the area. But grid average data is included here as a potential source, data source for standard delivery renewable energy, since it is nevertheless a data source that may be used for market-based scope 2 accounting and is commonly used by companies as an estimation of standard delivery renewable energy, if not explicitly to account for standard delivery renewable energy. And this data can be state or balancing authority or regional or national in scope. So in general, we found that a great deal of variation between and within these data categories, which might be problematic for credible standard delivery renewable energy claims. The report describes some of the areas of variability across data categories, in terms of, first, data format and unit. So data can be a resource mix in megawatt hours, default renewable energy percentage, or a GHG emissions factor in CO2 or CO2e. There's also variation in terms of the energy resources that are included. What is renewable energy, right? Different states and different data sources have different definitions. So for example, there's a wide variety around a wide variability around biomass. So different data sources might include different resources and amounts of renewable energy, and they might not align with a given consumer's understanding or definition of renewable energy or their goals. Zero emissions resources, which include resources like nuclear and large scale hydro, should not necessarily be claimed, might not be necessarily claimed as renewable. And so extrapolating renewable energy use data from emissions factors might be difficult. And then there's sort of consumer delivered electricity versus electricity production. So some data sources, again, do not reflect the attributes of consumer delivered electricity. For example, grid averages, grid average emissions factors, generation or production data, even if it accounts for imports and exports, may include attributes that have been transacted to specific customers and therefore should not be claimed as standard delivery renewable energy. There's also capacity, prospective delivery data. There's compliance program data, RPS compliance data that might include multipliers or banked generation, alternative compliance payments that does not reflect exclusively uniquely delivered megawatt hours. So in order for a data source to support a credible renewable energy usage claim, it must represent delivered electricity, meaning it must reflect transactions of specified generation and attributes, and for renewable energy, that's RECs, to other customers as well as imports and exports of power. There's also variability in terms of methodology. So what are the specific rules for what gets counted and how to count? Different data sources are developed using different methodologies. GHG emissions from biomass might be reported as zero. Some data does not count attributes that were procured unbundled. Other data does not count generation, other data sort of assigns emissions to generation that has been unbundled from its attributes or null power. Data might not account for the impacts of imported and exported power. So there may be different limitations, on things like vintage of generation or the age of the generator. And again, regulatory compliance data may reflect policy tools, including credit multipliers and alternative compliance payments and waivers. There's also verification. They might differ in terms of verification. Some data sources are third-party verified. Others have undergone internal review. Data from tracking systems rely on sort of automated protocols to check quality, and others have no verification requirements at all. Transparency, data varies in terms of transparency of its methodology and its upstream sort of data sources. Scope, so geographic scope or the coverage of the data source. So to which customers or what area does the data apply? Is it region specific, state specific, supplier specific, product specific? And then there's also temporal scope. Is it annual or is it quarterly data? Is it hourly data? Consumers with operations across service territories and regions may need to rely on multiple data sources with different characteristics and methodologies. And then finally, frequency. So data, different data sources are published on different timescales, and this may or may not align with customer reporting objectives or timeframes. Historical data can be annual, with a 1-year lag to facilitate verification activities. Some, like grid averages, may be even more delayed due to sort of complex data aggregation that has to occur. And verification can slow things down too. So the data backgrounder that we appended to the report and published describes more of the variation within data categories and between specific data sources. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through those here, but please see that report for more on the data variability within the data categories. And finally, potential data criteria and considerations. Consumers obviously need help determining which data sources to use to account for standard delivery renewable energy. We need criteria to evaluate them. We may need a hierarchy to put them in order where consumers have access to multiple or different data sources. And so in our report, we provide a sort of a framework to help identify circumstances where standard delivery renewable energy offers the consumer a credible renewable energy use claim and where it might not. So we provide this list of credibility criteria for data sources, which is sort of broadly aligned with the scope 2 quality criteria for the market-based method. And so these are, the data describes delivered electricity, generation information within the data is accurate, which means, RECs are issued in a tracking system or based on meter data. All ownable attributes that define the generation being claimed are aggregated, so RECs are fully aggregated. Attributes are exclusively owned by or retired on behalf of the customer or a group including the customer, so no double counting. And then attributes are not double claimed, no double claiming, and generation occurs in the same market and relative time frame as consumption. So some market and vintage sort of limitations. And then within the data, the data sources that meet those credibility criteria, we identified additional data quality considerations that consumers may want to look at, which could be used in to sort of put these data sources in order. And then that includes oversight, who manages the database, what's the quality of the upstream data sources, the transparency of the data, of the methodology, the data scope and specificity, included renewable resources and their environmental quality, the publication frequency and age, and consistency with other data sources. Back. That finishes my presentation and I'll pass it back over. Of course, there are a lot of other questions that remain about whether there should be different criteria for data that includes standard delivery renewable energy. And of course, it puts data that meets these credibility criteria plus a consumer's own criteria based on their own objectives may not actually be available. So this highlights the needs of consumers looking to make these claims and the gaps that exist with existing data sources. So that's it for me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So next we'll be turning it over to James from EPA. James, if you'd like to share your slides.
Yeah, can you see it okay?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you to CRS and Target and everybody else who is involved in this effort. It's great to be part of it. And I think it's, one of these kinds of topics that people are talking about more these days. And I was asked to come to today's presentation and talk a little bit around how the concept of leadership relates to the context of standard delivery of renewable energy through a standard utility or electricity provider offering. So we covered a little bit of this, I think, in the previous discussion, so I'll quickly go through it. But there's roughly two primary ways that people get electricity in the market today, and that's either to self-generate it themselves or purchase it from somebody else who generates it on your behalf. And for many of us, the standard default delivery of electricity from your electricity provider is how we mostly get purchased electricity. And we rarely have much control over the resources or mix of resources in many cases that that standard default offering includes. However, consumers know that electricity is a significant source of emissions and air pollution, and consumers also understand that they can reduce that impact of their electricity consumption by choosing cleaner sources or how their electricity is generated. And as a consequence, the voluntary consumer choice component of the market is a powerful driver for change. And as many of you are aware, there's organizations of all types and sizes are setting aggressive renewable energy targets and greenhouse gas reduction targets, and essentially trying to reduce their climate risk and potentially reduce the cost associated with their electricity use. And by making a choice in how consumers' demand for electricity is generated, consumers can not only reduce the environmental impact of their electricity use, but also take a leadership position in how electricity is generated to meet consumer demand broadly. So this slide shows the historical role that voluntary consumers have played in evolving the US electricity sector towards cleaner sources of electricity. So how does leadership tie into the voluntary consumer action element represented in this graph? Well, in 2001, the US EPA launched the Green Power Partnership in part to encourage organizations to lead by example and choose how their power is generated in order to meet their demand for electricity. And by proactively exercising their choice as a consumer for how their power is generated, their demand signal for cleaner sources of electricity helped evolve the US electricity sector towards cleaner sources of generation. The key component of that demand driver, though, is to make sure that their voluntary demand signal is incremental or goes above and beyond what is otherwise available to consumers in the market. There are several questions that arise relating to what one can claim about the supply or consumption of electricity. For example, how does a consumer tell whether their proactive voluntary choice for renewable electricity is actually making a difference in the market? And how does a consumer know that what they are consuming is not being double counted or claimed? And what kinds of claims can a provider make about what they supply consumers? Well, the answer is founded in market instruments such as renewable energy certificates. Since physical electricity on a shared grid tells us a little about its source or origin, market instruments are used here in the US as well as around the globe to allow consumers to answer some of these important questions. And by owning a renewable energy certificate, a consumer denies it from being counted or claimed by another entity in the market. Ensuring that your renewable electricity purchase is built on top of what is already available to consumers ensures that you are making a difference through your procurements and use. As we've already heard, the standard delivery mix or renewable energy components of that mix come from a range of different sources. And while it's entirely credible for a consumer to potentially claim specific components of the standard delivery mix, leadership can be demonstrated by making sure that your proactive choice for how your power is generated goes above and beyond what is otherwise available to you or mandated by regulation. In this way, the consumer has an incremental or additive impact on the types of generation that ultimately serve demand across the shared grid. But there are several considerations that have already been identified and were discussed and evaluated through this report and its findings. If a consumer wants to claim components of the standard delivery renewable energy mix, there are several things worth considering. Are providers conveying the necessary energy attributes required by the consumer to substantiate renewable electricity use? Do the renewable energy components of the mix meet national standards for resource quality? Is the generation stated as being delivered temporally matching the consumer's time frame of consuming electricity? And can consumers have confidence in the different sources of renewable electricity not being double counted or claimed by someone else? And lastly, how should a consumer align their procurement strategy to meet both an RE or a greenhouse gas reduction target when some of the standard delivery mix is from non-renewable but zero emitting sources such as nuclear power? And lastly, one other component that is important to think about is, are there significant opportunities in the market for consumers to perhaps advance regulation that drives demand or availability of renewables to all consumers over taking a leadership position by just consuming voluntary procurement only. Consumers have to navigate a complex set of issues as it relates to claiming use of renewable electricity from various sources in the standard delivery mix and making sure that their procurements make a difference. So in summary, while consumers of the standard delivery mix may often have a legitimate claim to renewable energy components of the mix, it can be important to consider whether counting renewable energy delivered to you passively is in line with the leadership and impact you desire to have in the market. From EPA's perspective, there are several things that you can do as a consumer to position yourself as a leader and make a difference in the marketplace. The single biggest thing as a consumer that you can do is to proactively and voluntarily choose green power over other existing sources of electricity or even renewable electricity that's available to you through passive procurement. The next biggest thing or consideration is to ensure that the consumer's demand for renewable energy goes above and beyond what is otherwise available to that consumer or required to be delivered by regulation or mandate to consumers. And lastly, consumers should make sure that they have a clear claim to the underlying energy attributes of generation generated by renewable resources, whether it is through proactive voluntary procurement or through the standard delivery mix. In looking at leadership more broadly, there's a lot of other things organizations and buyers can do to take a leadership position. EPA recently this year has retooled our Green Power Leadership Awards application to actually feature a range of different issues that consumers can take in the market to establish their leadership and evaluate their impacts through their voluntary procurement. So I would encourage you to check out EPA's Green Power Leadership Awards specifically to learn more about other elements of leadership and impact beyond green power use. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly. And let's see here.
Yeah, James, thank you. I think if you stop sharing, then I can share my screen.
Yes, I'm looking at how to, I've lost my Zoom bar. Hold on a second.
You might need to exit presentation view really quickly.
Yeah. Huh. It's gone.
All right.
I'm going to log off and I'll just disappear. I'll come back.
Okay.
How's that?
Well, that's the old technology trick. Yeah, it always works. So, okay.
Has that worked out?
No.
No. Okay, there we go. And Peggy, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thanks for having me on this webinar. I'm Holly Ladd. I'm the Energy Manager with Target. And I'm going to talk about why we're interested in this issue, kind of Target's journey in the renewable energy space, some of the challenges we've had with renewable electricity accounting prior to this guidance, and then some of the values that we see in having more industry consensus and guidance on how to standardize this space. So Target, like many large businesses in the US today, has been on this journey moving from really just an energy consumer to more of a producer and a consumer at the same time of energy as new options in the market have changed. We've always really prided ourselves on very energy efficient stores. We were an early adopter of demand response in the retail industry. Nearly 20 years ago, we started with our first rooftop solar installation in the Los Angeles area. And then just in the last 5 years or so, we've really stepped up and joined our peers in large scale renewable energy purchases with the 4 virtual power purchase agreements that we've announced in the US. We're also doing renewable energy partnerships with utilities. That includes 4 green tariffs that we are participating in across the country, and also a real emphasis on working with utilities on clean energy and resource plans, state policy level actions that we can support as both a large consumer of electricity, as well as on behalf of our US-based supply chain and customers. We'll talk about in a bit that Scope 3 emissions as a retailer are very significant and important to us, and greening the grid through more clean energy is a key lever towards addressing those as well. We're also getting into the electric vehicle space, where we have over 100 stores now with high-speed EV charging. And as I said, we're working on renewable energy with both our US and international supply chain partners to help them meet their own renewable electricity and greenhouse gas goals. So really drilling on the clean energy goals. We, like other companies, have a 100% renewable electricity goal. Ours is by 2030, and that's measured currently on an annual basis. And we have goals to reduce both our Scope 2 emissions from our own operations and working on Scope 3 reduction. When we think about the levers we have to meeting those goals, I really think about it in these 4 blue buckets that are on the screen. One, behind the meter solar is a big part of our portfolio, where we have over 500 stores with rooftop solar in the US. We don't retain the recs for all of those, but when we do include those in our accounting. Utility green tariff agreements, virtual power purchase agreements, and then utility generation supply. We have over 400 different utilities that we have accounts for with our 1,800 plus stores in the US. And so as you work across the country, some are clearly leaders in this space and decarbonizing their delivered supply to customers, and others less so. But some of the jurisdictions we work in, we have all 4 of these activities going on, either at a site basis or regionally. And without the guidance that CRS has led, it was somewhat confusing, to be candid, on how you combine all of these sources. So do you follow more of a greenhouse gas accounting framework that's laid out in the Scope 2 standard, where a REC replaces a megawatt hour of utility supplied electricity? Or are these going to work together and layer up, if you will, work in tandem, which is, maybe fits more of what's happening really on the electric grid today. So before this guidance, that was pretty ambiguous. And to just emphasize the scale of this issue for large customers with lots of sites, there are hundreds of utilities across the country. And we started in 2018 trying to ask them for their grid mix data and their greenhouse gas CO2 emission factor that would help with our Scope 2 accounting. So this is just a map to illustrate the investor-owned utilities in the US, but there are also hundreds, if not thousands, of cooperative utilities and municipal utilities that some of them we work with. So our first year of asking for this data, we got maybe 20 responses, of which 10 had enough information to make it usable. So to Todd's point, they actually had retired RECs that were associated with the renewable electricity that they were reporting to us. It was within a relatively recent time frame, and it was focused on delivered energy, so not just their own generation, but if they're making purchases, it accounted for that. The next year in 2019, that stepped up from maybe 10 usable responses to 20. And in the last year or so, we've gotten even higher. I really encourage people to read the data resources that document that Todd presented, because there are a lot of people working on this problem, I would say, of how to get more transparent and just more data, period, in this space in the US. And we've worked with the World Resources Institute and the Edison Electric Institute and other customers on a centralized database to try to collect some of this data, so we're all not sending emails everywhere. But I will just say, in some of these jurisdictions, like I said, we have green tariffs that cover part of a stored load. We may have behind the meter solar with RECs. We have a utility that may be grading their supply, and we have a virtual power purchase agreement generating in the same region. And so this guidance helps to understand how these all work together, and I encourage people to read that. I also say that this is one example of how far this space has come. One of the utilities kind of due middle of this slide is Mid-American Energy. And I highlight them because they were one of the first in the country to create a standardization and transparency about renewables beyond compliance, RECs beyond compliance, that they were going to retire on behalf of all customers, so that their customers could say that they were, I think in 2019, 61.3% renewable power through Mid-American's significant wind resources in that area and the RECs that they retired. They have that annually reported to the Iowa Utilities Board with documented data sources and the REC retirement information. And so that was really exciting, and we were excited to use that data. But again, before this guidance, there was unclear in some of the leadership world on the value of that. We were actually told by one leadership program, not James's, but another's, that because although Mid-American had retired it for all customers, because Target Corporation wasn't specifically listed on that form, that we couldn't use it, although we are a customer of theirs. So it was things like this that didn't seem to make sense, and I think why we needed some industry guidance to help clarify some of these examples. So I just have a few more slides because I want to get into Q&A on some of the values I see of the guidance, which I hope you all read. I think for me, it really aligns that renewables work together, that aligns the accounting from standard and voluntary renewables, how you put these together with what I'll say public policy. I used just some examples of things that were a little counterintuitive before this guidance. I was once in a meeting with a utility and large customers and policymakers working on a clean energy program in a state. And we were advocating that the utility procure more renewable energy in its resource plan. And the utility representative said to me, well, you all don't count the grid in your renewable energy goals. The industry leadership world doesn't let you count those NGO space. So why should we listen to you, basically, if you're not going to use these renewables in your goals? And that's, seems it's not the outcome you want, because we want to use the size of our influence with our employment base and our presence around the country to help push clean energy policy. So you want to avoid things like that where you're actually competing. And you can think about in parts of the US where there's such significant transmission constraint right now, there's, from my vantage point, there might be some competition going on between utilities trying to increase renewable energy for their portfolio and large corporate buyers also trying to do the voluntary space. Competition can be healthy for sure to spur new investment, but you also don't want to make this like, if they have it, I can't get it piece. We want to all work on this together. I also say that the guidance begins to connect for the first time in renewable electricity accounting, some concept of the location of load and where the supply is in particular renewable energy projects. So, if you're looking at our target's load in Colorado, we're going to look at Xcel Energy Colorado's certified renewable percentage, where they're retiring RECs on behalf of customers, and think about the supply mix they have there, along with the green tariff we're participating in, and any on-site solar RECs, and work these together. Otherwise, and then how the value of that REC, so to speak, is kind of somewhat connected to the value of the gap we have between what Xcel is already providing us and towards our 100% goal. And so it starts to have a little more rootedness in location, but not too specific. So I don't want to get too much in the details, but read the guidance, because I think that really helps connect load and supply a little bit more. I'm hoping that this provides consistency among reporting companies, because if your job is like mine, you start to work on these calculations, your leadership is going to ask, well, how is Amazon or Walmart or whoever your competitor, how are they calculating the standard delivery? Are we being compared or doing it consistently? And so the guidance is still high level and gives a framework for how to approach it, but I'm hopeful that that will help improve consistency in reporting of how companies are reporting the data sources they're using for this, and provide more of a level playing field that will hopefully, by reducing uncertainty, lead to more goal adoption among corporate customers. If they have clear understanding of how they can measure standard delivery and its role in corporate renewable energy claims, I'm hoping that beyond Fortune 500 companies, that the next year will start to adopt clean energy goals. And again, see the value of public policy and utility work within those programs. And with that, I want to stop because I'm excited for a lot of Q&A that's pouring in. And again, really appreciate CRS's leadership in this work, and we're excited to participate.
Thank you, Holly. That was a great conversation. So for this part, we have about 10 minutes left. We are going to not share slides for this and just have a bit of a conversation. But I have been aggregating questions, and just to kick it off, there were a couple terminology clarifying questions that I'd like to get out of the way. So Todd, I'm going to ask you to weigh in briefly on these. So we got requests for how you define delivered electricity, as well as defining what the market is regarding renewable energy claims. Take those together.
Sure, yeah. So, delivered electricity or sort of specified power. And then we also talk about sort of delivered renewable energy as sort of a subset of specified power, delivered electricity. So specified power, is basically just, electricity that's derived from and traceable to a specific generator or a set of generators using an auditable sort of contract trail or tradable instrument. And that would make, delivered renewable energy or consumed renewable energy or retail renewable energy, the amount or the percentage of renewable energy that is serving or consumed or purchased by or delivered to specific retail electricity customers or load or a specific geographic area. So again, cannot be directly measured at the point of delivery or consumption, or determined based on the proximity of the generation sources. So measurement requires an instrument or a method for allocating or sort of tracking renewable generation attributes to load. And in the United States, REC procurement, whether bundled or unbundled from the energy and retirement, by or on behalf of the consumer, is required for sort of accurate accounting of delivered renewable energy. And then so related, the question was about sort of market, the definition of a market with respect to geographic boundaries for claims. So there's a couple resources on this. One is the GHG Protocol Scope 2 guidance, which provides sort of a general definition for market boundaries as a quality criteria, as well as a Making Credible Renewable Energy Usage Claims paper from RE100. Both are very similar and sort of less than ideally provide a very broad definition of what a market is in terms of credible claims. It's generally an area where there's a sort of consistent regulatory framework and policy framework governing the electricity sector, as well as sort of, physical interconnection. We don't, it's sort of the market boundaries vary depending on, the market itself. It's generally considered that the US represents a single market. The EU can represent a single market with respect to the delivery of attributes, which don't necessarily need to follow the physical physical deliverability of electricity boundaries. So it really sort of depends on the market, is a broad answer to that question.
Thank you. It's a big question. So we also got a few questions specifically on the greenhouse gas protocol and the Scope 2 guidance. So I'm just going to kind of summarize that question and try to provide a quick answer. So the greenhouse gas protocol team participated as a stakeholder in the development of this process. It definitely was a reviewer and provided feedback. The guidance is actually very strongly built on the Scope 2 guidance itself. So it extrapolates some of the information that was laid down in greenhouse gas accounting and applies it more to the renewable energy accounting. But for all intents and purposes, it's very consistent with that. So it should not be problematic from a greenhouse gas protocol perspective. As related to that, there are also a couple questions about needing to revisit scope 2 accounting. So we've talked a lot today about impact and is this really reflecting impact? And our response to that would be that, well, that's a whole webinar, but we think there's a value for scope 2 accounting. It's, as I think James said, the easiest way to procure renewable energy for the most potential participants in the market. So it's something that's important that this doesn't become something that only elite and advanced buyers can do. But we think that there is a desire and a need for recognizing more impact. And there are ways that we can measure that build on top of the scope 2 guidance. And those are some of the questions that the CAP program is hoping to address in the coming years. And we hope to work with you all on those. James, I've got a bit of a data question for you. There was one question: can we address the EPA eGrid data and its usefulness for standard delivery renewable energy?
Yeah, so EPA has had a long-standing database called eGrid that has been used in greenhouse gas accounting and represents sort of average grid emissions related to different regions of the country. And EPA has divided up the country into what we call eGrid subregions. That is reflective of generation data. And so I think one of the core challenges that we're trying to get at is whether, generation data is really reflective of what's delivered. And I think ultimately you have to look a little more carefully when it comes to the ability to claim certain portions of the delivered grid mix, is making sure that the consumer who's receiving power actually has a clear claim to those components. And while eGrid is a good assessment for average grid emissions, I'm not sure it's going to support, renewable electricity use claims specifically, because you have to take a closer look at the underlying conveyance of attributes to the consumer from points of generation.
Thank you. We've got just 3 more minutes here. So we have, for Holly, we had a specific question about targets goals. So for a typical solar PV array at your stores, what % of the store power is created by the PV array, and do you use storage to handle non-generating hours? And do you have a scope 1 reduction goal?
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. I saw some of those. So a typical solar system on a target store can produce enough energy to be equivalent to 30 to 40% of the store's annual electricity use. And that varies by size of store and solar radiation. We do have some solar and storage systems, mostly in California and Hawaii. And we do look at energy market prices and thinking about the dispatch strategy for that. We also have a scope 1 goal. I called out scope 2 here, really focus on the renewable electricity pieces of it, but we have a goal to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions 30% by 2030 from 2017 baseline, and reduce our scope 3 emissions just from purchased goods and services, which is our biggest scope 3 category by far, also 30% by 2030. So yes, it's also been certified by the SBTI initiative.
Thank you. So I think to close out, one quick question. This guidance remains at a theoretical level, but reality is such data sets are not available to do this accounting. What are the next steps? Is a platform going to be created to gather all this data? I'm going to let someone volunteer because I think we could all say something here.
I volunteer Todd first.
Right, so yeah, obviously we identified a number of different challenges, especially with respect to sort of the practical implications of this, although we were able to agree that you can make these claims. It may be that in a practical sense you can't. So how do you overcome these barriers? What's sort of the path forward? was something I'm thinking about a little bit. Obviously, I hope to sort of continue to look at this through the Clean Energy Accounting Project and look into some of these questions. But obviously, if it's, you could sort of go with an all voluntary approach to make sure you're getting the data quality that you need. You can, of course, work with your utilities, I think, to also get the data that you need. We provide a framework, obviously, for criteria for this data that can be shared with your utilities. That can be standardized among utilities to help create sort of consistent sources of data. And so the more we sort of normalize that and standardize that as credible criteria, I think the better data we will get. So, you know, obviously this gets more complicated with things like hourly accounting, and there are remaining issues to address there about how you get credible hourly residual mixes and things like that, which we hope to address through CAP. But I'll turn it over to other folks for their perspectives as well.
I'll just briefly say I put a hyperlink of one source that we've worked with others, and I mentioned it, the EEI and WRI work to try to have a centralized database for utility grid mix data and utility specific delivered mix CO2 data. And part of the big benefit of this work not only being centralized, and I think the current data set captures that data for utilities that make up 43% of US electric sales, but a big push in the instructions you'll see is that all the renewables used for both the mixed data and the CO2 emission factor have to have RECs retired for them. And that was a clear ask customers made of utilities in that work. And we learned a lot that historically some utilities hadn't done that because of confusion or kind of lack of clear understanding what customers are really looking for, guidance projects like this. And so that is clearly part of the instructions of utilities who were submitting to that data set. So it's a big benefit, and we'd love to get more utilities in there and really try to centralize this data, because I am so tired of sending emails asking for it when you're a big user like Target. So check that out if you haven't already.
Yeah, I'll just add on that is that I think EPA has been thinking about this issue as well. I think we recognize that there's some gaps in information that's available to consumers, and we've had plenty of partners who've asked the same supplier through 2 different points of contact what their mix is all about, and they get 2 different answers. And so I think standardization is a big part of that. And then, you know, I think really working directly with suppliers to get that information and coming up with some sort of framework to do that, and then socializing the results of that across all consumers so people don't have to keep reinventing the wheel is something we've been thinking about how we could play a role. And there's other federal agencies that are also thinking about this stuff too. So, you know, perhaps we can collectively move to a better place.
The one last thing I wanted to add is that I know we're over, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the potential for nationwide all generation certificate